Commander Jake Morrison watched the stars from the bridge of his ship Aurora and knew something was wrong with the way they looked today, because they seemed to be moving in patterns that stars should never move in, and when he called for his science officer Amy Carter to check the sensors, she told him that 3 massive objects were coming out of what looked like holes in space itself. The holes grew bigger and brighter until Jake had to shield his eyes from the light that poured through them, and when the light faded, he saw ships that were unlike anything humans had ever built, because they were made of what looked like crystal and metal, mixed together in shapes that hurt his brain to look at for too long. And each ship was at least 10 times bigger than Aurora, which was already one of the biggest ships humanity had ever sent to explore the stars. Amy turned to Jake with wide eyes and said that the ships were sending some kind of signal that their computers were trying to understand, and after a few minutes the main screen lit up with an image that made everyone on the bridge take a step back, because it showed a creature that looked like it had been made by combining a giant insect with something from the deep ocean. The creature had too many eyes that moved in different directions, and its body seemed to flow like water, but also had hard parts like shell or bone sticking out in places that made no sense. And when it spoke, the sounds that came from it were like music mixed with the noise that metal makes when it bends too far. But somehow their translation computer turned those sounds into words they could understand. The creature said its name was High Arbitrator Zethkar, and that it spoke for something called the Collective, which was a group of many different species that had joined together under the rule of the strongest and wisest races in the galaxy. And Jake felt his stomach drop when he realized that this was first contact with alien life, and it was not going the way anyone on Earth had hoped it would go. Zethkar told them that the Collective had been watching Earth for some time, and had decided that humans showed promise for joining their great alliance of species, but that this joining would not be a choice because primitive species like humans could not be trusted to make such important decisions for themselves and would need guidance from their betters until they learned how to behave properly in galactic society. Jake tried to stay calm as he told Zethkar that humanity appreciated the offer, but preferred to remain independent and would be happy to start trade and friendship with the Collective as equals. But the alien made a sound that their computer said was laughter, and explained that Jake had misunderstood the situation completely. The High Arbitrator said that this was not a negotiation or a request, but simply information about what was going to happen next, and that Earth had 7 days to prepare for what he called peaceful integration, which would involve the removal of current human governments and their replacement with collective administrators who would help humanity learn to be useful members of galactic civilization. When Jake asked what would happen if humanity refused this generous offer, Zethkar made that laughing sound again, and said that refusal was not possible because species that could not see the wisdom of joining the Collective were clearly too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing and would be removed so that their worlds could be given to more deserving species. The alien ship cut off communication after that, and Jake found himself staring at empty space where the image had been while his crew looked at him with faces full of fear and confusion, because they had all grown up believing that when humans finally met aliens, it would be a day of celebration and wonder. But instead it felt like the end of everything they had ever known. Amy was the first to speak, and she asked if they should send a message to Earth right away, but Jake shook his head and told her to wait, because he needed to think about how to explain this situation without causing panic among the billions of people back home who had no idea that their planet was about to be invaded by creatures with technology that made human weapons look like stone knives. Chief Engineer Ryan Webb suggested that maybe they could learn something useful about the alien ships by watching them from a distance, and Jake agreed that this was a good idea. So they moved Aurora to what they hoped was a safe location, and began recording everything they could about the 3 crystal ships that hung in space, like sleeping giants. The aliens did not seem to care that the human ship was watching them, and Jake realized that this was because they did not see Aurora as a threat any more than a human would worry about an ant watching them work. And this thought made him angry in a way that surprised him because he had always considered himself a peaceful man who preferred talking to fighting. The hours passed. Jake and his crew learned that the alien ships were incredibly advanced with energy sources they could not identify in weapons that seemed to bend space itself around their targets, and the more they learned, the more impossible their situation seemed. because how could humanity fight against technology that was hundreds of years ahead of anything they had ever dreamed of building? But Jake also noticed something else about the aliens, and that was how confident they seemed about everything they did, as if they had done this same thing many times before with other species and had never once been surprised by anything those species had tried to do to resist. And this confidence made him wonder if maybe there was something the aliens did not know about humanity that could be used against them when the time came to send their report to Earth. Jake chose his words carefully because he knew that panic would help no one, and that humanity would need to be smart and brave if they were going to survive the next 7 days. So he told them about the aliens and their demands. But he also told them that these creatures had clearly underestimated humanity before and might be making the same mistake again. The message would take hours to reach Earth and hours more for any reply to come back. So Jake settled in to wait and watch the alien ships while trying to think of anything that might help his species avoid the fate that Zethkar had promised them. And as he watched the crystal ships move through space with their impossible grace, he found himself hoping that somewhere back home someone much smarter than him was already working on a plan. President Catherine Lang sat in the emergency meeting room deep under the White House and stared at the report from Commander Morrison while trying to understand how the world had changed so completely in just a few hours, because this morning, humanity had been alone in the universe and now they were facing invasion by aliens who thought humans were too primitive to deserve freedom. General Patricia Stone looked up from her tablet where she had been reading the technical analysis of the alien ships and shook her head as she told everyone that conventional weapons would be useless against technology. This advanced in that even their best nuclear missiles would probably not be able to scratch the surface of those crystal ships. The room fell silent as the leaders of Earth tried to think of any way to fight back against an enemy that could cross space in ships bigger than cities and had weapons that could probably destroy entire continents. But then Dr. Paul Grant from the Deep Projects Division cleared his throat and said that maybe the situation was not as hopeless as it looked. Dr. Grant stood up and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with a three-dimensional map of nearby star systems. And President Lang gasped when she saw that dozens of the stars were marked with pulsing lights that indicated human presence. And she asked how this was possible when everyone knew that humanity had never sent colonies beyond the solar system. Scientists smiled and explained that this was not exactly true, because 15 years ago a secret project had been started to send sleeper ships to promising worlds within 50 light-years of Earth, and these ships carried everything needed to start new human settlements that would remain completely hidden until they received activation codes from Earth. Admiral Carl Bishop leaned forward and asked how many ships had been sent and how many people were living on these hidden worlds, and Dr. Grant consulted his notes before telling them that 47 star systems now contained human colonies, with a total population of roughly 800 million people who had been building industrial bases and defense fleets while maintaining complete radio silence. The room exploded with questions as everyone tried to understand how such a massive project could have been kept secret for so long, and Dr. Grant explained that it had been authorized by a joint committee of world leaders who believed that humanity needed insurance against exactly this kind of situation, and that the colonists had volunteered, knowing they might never see Earth again. General Stone asked about the defense fleets that Dr. Grant had mentioned, and he told her that each colony had been equipped with shipyards and the plans for weapons that were improvements on Earth technology, and that some of the older colonies had been developing their own innovations based on the unique resources of their New World's President Lang wanted to know how they could coordinate with colonies that were dozens of light years away. And Dr. Grant showed them the quantum communication arrays that had been secretly built on Earth and in each colony system and could send messages instantly across any distance using principles that most physicists still did not fully understand. The revelation that humanity was not limited to one world, but had secretly spread across dozens of star systems, changed everything about their situation, because the aliens thought they were dealing with a primitive single-planet civilization, but instead they would be facing an interstellar empire that had been preparing for war for 15 years. Dr. Grant continued his briefing by explaining that the colonies had been chosen for their strategic value, as well as their ability to support human life, and that many of them had been developing specialized capabilities, like the mining colonies that had turned asteroids into weapons platforms and the agricultural worlds that had built massive orbital facilities that could be converted to military use. Admiral Bishop asked if the colonial defense fleets would be able to reach Earth in time to help fight the aliens, and Dr. Grant shook his head but said that this might not be necessary because the aliens had positioned their ships in Earth orbit, thinking they only needed to threaten one world. But they had no idea that attacking Earth would mean declaring war on an entire civilization. General Stone pulled up tactical displays showing the 3 alien ships and asked how the colonial fleets compared to this level of technology, and Dr. Grant admitted that the aliens still had better individual ships but said that 47 star systems working together could build a lot more ships than 3 alien vessels could handle. The discussion continued for hours as Earth leaders learned about secret colonies they never knew existed and tried to understand how this changed their options for dealing with the alien ultimatum. And slowly a plan began to form that would show the collective that they had made a serious mistake in their evaluation of humanity. Meanwhile, in the Kepler 442 system, Admiral Helen Cruz received the activation codes that she had been waiting 15 years to see, and immediately called her senior staff to the command center of New Geneva Station, where they began preparing for the first real military action in colonial history. The defense fleet at New Geneva consisted of 12 ships that had been built using improved Earth designs and local materials, and while they were smaller than the crystal ships threatening Earth, they had been designed by engineers who knew that every bolt and wire might mean the difference between survival and extinction. Lieutenant Commander Tony Martinez reported that all ships were ready and that their special weapons had been loaded and tested, including gravity mines that could create artificial gravity wells strong enough to crush even the strongest materials, and kinetic accelerators that could throw asteroids at near light speed. Similar preparations were taking place across human space as colonies that had spent years building peaceful settlements suddenly transformed into military bases ready to defend their species. And Admiral Cruz knew that the aliens had no idea what they had just awakened, because humanity had not been sitting quietly on Earth waiting for contact but had been spreading across the galaxy and preparing for exactly this moment. The mining station at Wolf 359 began converting its asteroid-moving equipment into massive railguns, while the agricultural platforms orbiting New Harmony prepared to launch kinetic bombardment attacks, and the submarine builders of New Sydney activated stealth ships that could hide in space using technology developed from underwater warfare. Each colony had been given copies of all human military knowledge and had been encouraged to develop their own innovations based on local conditions and resources. And after 15 years of development, they had created weapons and tactics that Earth military planners had never imagined. Dr. Grant finished his briefing by telling the Earth leaders that the aliens had made their evaluation based on observing one world and had never considered that a young species might achieve interstellar colonization before making contact with galactic civilization, and this mistake was going to cost them dearly. President Lang looked around the room at faces that had changed from despair to determination and asked if Dr. Grant was sure that the colonial fleets would be able to coordinate effectively after so many years of isolation. And he smiled as he activated the quantum communicators. And suddenly the room filled with voices from across human space, all reporting ready for action. The meeting ended with Earth leaders finally understanding that humanity was not alone and helpless, but was actually an interstellar civilization that had been quietly preparing for war, and that the aliens who thought they were conquering a primitive world were about to learn what happened when you threatened not just a planet but an entire species that had spread across the stars. High Arbitrator Zethkar floated in his command chamber aboard the flagship Eternal Dominance and reviewed the intelligence reports about the third planet of this unremarkable system while feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from another successful evaluation of a primitive species that would soon join the collective or be removed from existence. The reports indicated that the humans were a typical single-world civilization with crude fusion engines and kinetic weapons that posed no threat to collective technology. And Zethkar estimated that the cleansing operation would take no more than a few hours once the 7-day waiting period expired, because these creatures had nowhere to run and nothing to fight with. His tactical computers had analyzed every human settlement and military installation, and confirmed that their most advanced weapons were barely capable of damaging collective scout ships, much less the massive dreadnoughts of the 47th Cleansing Armada, and Zethkar felt confident that this would be another routine addition to the collective empire. Meanwhile, 68 light-years away, Admiral Helen Cruz stood on the observation deck of New Geneva Station and watched her task force form up in the shadow of the gas giant that hid their world from long-range sensors, while trying to remember everything she had learned about space combat during her training on Earth 15 years ago. The ships under her command were sleek and deadly-looking, vessels built from titanium, mined from local asteroids and powered by fusion reactors that had been improved far beyond anything Earth had possessed when the colonies were first established, and each ship bristled with weapons that had been designed by engineers who knew they might someday need to fight for human survival. Lieutenant Commander Tony Martinez approached and saluted before reporting that all 12 ships of the New Geneva Defense Fleet were ready for combat, and that the gravity mines had been loaded into their special launch tubes where they waited for targets that would soon learn why humans had spent so much time and effort studying how to kill things efficiently. Admiral Cruz nodded and asked about the status of their sister colonies, and Martinez told her that quantum communications were showing green lights from 39 other systems where human fleets were preparing for battle, and that total strength estimates showed over 400 ships ready to defend humanity. The Admiral smiled grimly as she thought about how the aliens had observed Earth for months without ever detecting the quantum communication signals that connected the homeworld to its hidden colonies, and had concluded that humans were limited to a single planet, when in reality they controlled an empire spanning dozens of star systems on New Harmony. The agricultural colony that had fed half the human settlements in this sector was transforming its massive orbital farming platforms into kinetic bombardment stations that could drop tungsten rods on targets with the force of nuclear weapons, and Chief Engineer Danny Rodriguez supervised the installation of targeting computers that could track ships moving at significant fractions of light speed. The farming platforms had been built to move enormous amounts of material between orbital growing chambers and planetary processing facilities, and it had been relatively simple to modify them to move tungsten rods toward enemy targets at velocities that would turn even heavily armored ships into expanding clouds of superheated plasma. Rodriguez had been born on New Harmony 20 years after the colony was established, and had grown up knowing that someday he might need to defend his world against unknown enemies, and he felt proud that his people had built something that could protect not just their own system, but contribute to the defense of all humanity. At the Wolf 359 mining station operations manager, Janet Foster watched her crews convert asteroid-moving equipment into ship-killing railguns that could accelerate projectiles to 20% of light speed using magnetic fields generated by the same fusion reactors that powered their mining operations. The miners had spent 15 years learning how to move rocks the size of mountains with precision and efficiency, and Foster knew that the same skills that let them redirect asteroids away from populated areas would allow them to redirect asteroids directly into enemy ships with devastating effect. Her crews were rough and practical people who had volunteered for mining work because they wanted to build something important for humanity, and now they were about to prove that their skills with explosives and heavy machinery could be just as valuable in war as they were in peace. The stealth shipyards of New Sydney had produced vessels that could hide from sensors using technology developed from submarine warfare, and Captain Linda Hayes commanded a squadron of ships that could approach enemy targets without being detected and deliver devastating attacks before disappearing back into the cosmic background radiation. Her ships were smaller than the heavy cruisers being prepared in other systems, but they were fast and nearly invisible, and Hayes knew that surprise attacks by stealth vessels had won wars throughout human history, and she was confident that the same tactics would work in space. Each colonial fleet had developed weapons and tactics based on the unique resources and expertise of their worlds, and after 15 years of preparation, they had created a military force that was perfectly adapted to fighting in the vast emptiness between stars, while remaining completely hidden from alien observation. The Hegemony intelligence services had focused on Earth and had concluded that humans were a typical primitive species with limited technology and no presence beyond their home system. But they had never looked for the quantum communication signals that connected human colonies, or noticed the carefully hidden shipyards that had been producing warships for over a decade. Admiral Cruz received reports from colony after colony confirming that defense fleets were ready and that specialized weapons had been tested and calibrated for the coming battle, and she felt a fierce pride in what humanity had accomplished in just 15 years of colonial expansion. The mining colonies reported railgun batteries that could throw asteroids across interstellar distances, while the agricultural worlds had kinetic bombardment platforms that could rain destruction on enemy formations, and the industrial colonies had built ships armed with weapons that Earth military planners had only dreamed about. But the most important advantage that humanity possessed was not technological but strategic, because the aliens thought they were fighting one world when they were actually about to face an entire civilization that had been spreading across space while they watched and evaluated only the most obvious human settlements. High Arbitrator Zethkar reviewed his battle plans and felt satisfied that the coming cleansing operation would proceed smoothly and efficiently, because his intelligence indicated that humans had no weapons capable of threatening collective ships and no way to escape their home system, even if they wanted to run. The arbitrator had overseen the absorption or destruction of 47 species during his long career, and humans appeared to be no different from any of the others, except perhaps slightly more primitive than average. And he looked forward to adding their world to the collective empire, or watching it burn depending on their response to his ultimatum. As the 7-day deadline approached, both sides prepared for battle, but only one side understood what was really about to happen, because while the aliens saw a single primitive world, humanity saw the first test of an interstellar defense network that had been built specifically for this moment. The 7 days passed slowly while High Arbitrator Zethkar waited for the humans to make their predictable choice between submission and destruction, and when the deadline arrived, he activated his communication systems expecting to receive either a message of surrender or silence that would indicate defiance and the need for immediate cleansing. Commander Jake Morrison appeared on the main display of the collective flagship with the same calm expression he had worn during their first meeting, and Zethkar felt pleased that this primitive creature was maintaining dignity in the face of inevitable defeat, because it showed that humans might have some potential value as servants of the collective. Jake spoke clearly and respectfully as he told the High Arbitrator that humanity had carefully considered the generous offer to join the collective, but had decided to decline, and would prefer to remain independent while establishing friendly relations with other galactic civilizations. Zethkar made the harmonic sound that indicated amusement, and told Jake that this choice meant extinction for his species, because creatures too foolish to accept collective wisdom were too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing, and he gave the order for his fleet to advance on Earth and begin cleansing protocols. But before his ships could move, space around the collective fleet began to fill with vessels that appeared from nowhere, as if the universe itself was creating them from empty vacuum, and Zethkar watched in growing confusion as hundreds of ships materialized around his 3 dreadnoughts in perfect military formation. The ships were clearly of human design, but they were larger and more advanced than anything his intelligence services had detected around Earth, and they moved with precision that indicated experienced crews and sophisticated command systems that should not have existed in a primitive single-world civilization. Admiral Helen Cruz appeared on his communication screen and identified herself as commander of the 1st Colonial Defense Fleet, and Zethkar felt a cold sensation in his primary nervous cluster as he realized that his evaluation of human capabilities had been seriously incomplete. More human commanders began appearing on separate channels as fleets from dozens of star systems reported their positions and readiness for battle, and Zethkar listened in growing horror to names like the Wolf 359 Mining Squadron and the New Harmony Agricultural Defense Force and the New Sydney Stealth Wing. His tactical displays showed human ships in 17 different star systems, all armed and ready for combat, and Zethkar finally understood that he had made the same mistake that had destroyed lesser arbitrators in the past by underestimating a species that had appeared primitive, but was actually far more advanced than initial observation suggested. Commander Morrison smiled as he explained that the collective intelligence services had been watching Earth for months but had somehow missed the quantum communication networks that connected the homeworld to its 47 colonial systems and the 800 million humans who had been living and building in those systems for 15 years. The human explained that Earth was not a single-world civilization, but the capital of an interstellar empire that had been expanding quietly while maintaining perfect secrecy, and that every colony had been equipped with shipyards and weapons, specifically designed to fight against unknown alien threats. Admiral Cruz transmitted tactical data, showing the positions and capabilities of colonial fleets, and Zethkar realized that his 3 ships were now surrounded by over 400 human vessels armed with weapons his computers could not identify, and operating under coordination protocols that suggested decades of military planning. The mining colonies had converted their industrial equipment into railguns that could accelerate asteroids to 20% of light speed, while the agricultural worlds had turned their orbital platforms into kinetic bombardment stations, and the submarine building expertise of some colonies had produced stealth ships that could approach targets undetected. Zethkar tried to understand how his intelligence services could have failed so completely, and realized that they had been looking for radio communications and obvious military installations, while the humans had been using quantum entanglement networks and hiding their weapons in civilian facilities. The High Arbitrator attempted to contact Collective Command for instructions, but discovered that human ships were jamming his long-range communications using techniques that suggested they had been studying collective technology for much longer than should have been possible. Admiral Cruz calmly explained that humanity had been preparing for exactly this situation since they first achieved interstellar travel, and that every colonial mission had included military advisors who understood that new worlds would eventually need to be defended against unknown threats. The human colonial fleets had spent 15 years developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to fight against technologically superior opponents, and had created innovations that Earth military planners had never imagined, including gravity mines that could create artificial gravity wells strong enough to crush crystalline hull materials. Commander Morrison told Zethkar that the collective evaluation protocols appeared to be designed for single-world civilizations that had never expanded beyond their home systems, but that humanity had refused to wait for contact before spreading across nearby star systems and establishing the industrial base needed to fight interstellar wars. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as more human fleets reported ready for combat, and Zethkar realized that his 3 dreadnoughts were facing an enemy that outnumbered them more than 100 to 1, and possessed weapons designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses of collective technology. President Catherine Lang appeared on the main communication channel representing not just Earth but the entire human colonial alliance, and she calmly informed Zethkar that his species had made a fundamental error in assuming that intelligence was rare and easily conquered. She explained that humans had achieved interstellar colonization, not through superior technology but through determination and careful planning, and that every colonial world had been established with the understanding that it might someday need to fight for human survival. The president offered the High Arbitrator a choice between withdrawing immediately to reconsider his approach to human relations, or facing the combined fleets of an interstellar civilization that had been specifically designed to win this exact type of conflict. Dr. Paul Grant provided additional data showing that human colonies existed in 47 star systems within a 50 light-year radius of Earth, and that each system had been developing its own military capabilities while maintaining complete communication security. Using quantum networks that were undetectable by collective sensors, Zethkar found himself in the impossible position of commanding a cleansing operation against a species that had secretly become more powerful than most collective member civilizations, and he realized that his choice was between humiliating retreat and certain destruction. The human fleets waited patiently while he considered his options, and Admiral Cruz reminded him that humanity preferred diplomatic solutions to military ones, but was fully prepared to demonstrate why attacking an interstellar civilization was different from conquering a single primitive world. Zethkar stared at the tactical displays showing hundreds of human warships surrounding his fleet. He finally understood that the galaxy contained species that did not wait for contact before preparing for war, and that humanity represented a completely new type of civilization that had grown beyond all collective models and predictions. High Arbitrator Zethkar made the only choice available to a military commander who found himself outnumbered 100 to 1 by an enemy that had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this battle, and he ordered his fleet to stand down and requested immediate communication with Collective Command to report that the evaluation of humanity required complete revision. The battle that followed was brief and decisive as human fleets demonstrated weapons and tactics that the Collective had never encountered before, and Zethkar watched his crystalline dreadnoughts shatter under the focused fire of gravity mines that created artificial singularities and railgun projectiles that moved too fast for his defensive systems to track. The flagship Eternal Dominance lost power and began drifting helplessly through space while human stealth ships appeared from nowhere to disable the remaining Collective vessels with surgical precision that left their crews alive. But their ships, completely unable to fight or flee, Admiral Helen Cruz contacted the disabled flagship and informed Zethkar that his ships had been captured rather than destroyed, because humanity preferred to establish diplomatic relations with new species rather than simply eliminating them, and that he and his crews would be treated according to human military standards for prisoners. Commander Jake Morrison explained that the demonstration had been necessary to convince the Collective that humanity was not a primitive single-world civilization that could be easily conquered, but an interstellar empire that had been built specifically to resist exactly the type of expansion that the Collective represented. President Catherine Lang appeared on the main communication channel, along with representatives from dozens of human colonial worlds, and she calmly informed Zethkar that the Human Colonial Alliance was prepared to open formal diplomatic relations with the Collective, but only as equals, rather than as subjects. The president explained that humanity had studied the history of galactic civilization through careful observation and had concluded that most species were conquered because they remained isolated on single worlds until contact was forced upon them, but that humans had refused to wait for contact before spreading across nearby star systems. Dr. Paul Grant provided detailed information about human colonial development and explained that 47 star systems now contained human settlements with their own industrial bases and military forces, and that the total human population across all worlds exceeded 1 billion people who had been preparing for interstellar conflict for over a decade. The revelation completely changed the balance of power in the local galactic region, because the Collective suddenly found itself facing not a primitive species that could be easily absorbed, but a mature interstellar civilization that controlled resources and territory comparable to major Collective member species. Admiral Cruz transmitted comprehensive data about human military capabilities and made it clear that the colonial fleets represented only the beginning of human expansion, because new settlements were being established every year, and each new world added to the growing strength of the Human Colonial Alliance. Zethkar found himself in communication with Collective Command, trying to explain how a routine cleansing operation had become a first contact situation with a previously unknown interstellar power, and how his intelligence services had completely failed to detect the existence of human colonies in nearby systems. The Collective leadership was forced to acknowledge that their evaluation protocols had been designed for single-world civilizations, and had never considered the possibility that a young species might achieve multi-system colonization before making contact with galactic civilization over the following weeks. Negotiations began between the Collective and the Human Colonial Alliance, as both sides worked to establish new diplomatic frameworks that could accommodate the reality of humanity as an interstellar power, rather than a primitive species awaiting conquest or absorption. Commander Morrison was promoted to admiral and placed in charge of human diplomatic relations, while maintaining command of the growing human fleet that continued to expand as new colonial shipyards came online and began producing warships designed with knowledge gained from studying captured Collective technology. The negotiations revealed that the Collective had been using the same expansion strategy for over 1,000 years and had successfully absorbed or destroyed nearly 200 species, but had never before encountered a civilization that had prepared for contact by secretly spreading across multiple star systems. President Lang worked with colonial governors to establish unified policies for dealing with galactic civilization while maintaining the independence that had driven human expansion, and it became clear that humanity would not be joining the Collective, but would be establishing itself as an equal power in regional politics. Arbitrator Zethkar found himself serving as the first Collective ambassador to humanity, and discovered that his new role required him to learn entirely new approaches to interspecies relations because humans refused to accept the subordinate position that other species had traditionally occupied. The High Arbitrator met regularly with Admiral Morrison to discuss trade agreements and territorial boundaries, and slowly began to understand that humanity represented a fundamental change in galactic civilization because they had achieved interstellar expansion through determination and planning rather than superior technology. Admiral Cruz returned to New Geneva to oversee the expansion of colonial military forces while maintaining the defensive networks that had proven so effective against collective forces, and she took pride in knowing that human colonies would never again be vulnerable to the kind of surprise attack that had threatened Earth. The mining colonies at Wolf 359 began sharing their railgun technology with other human settlements, while the agricultural worlds of New Harmony developed new orbital platforms that could support larger populations, and the submarine builders of New Sydney designed faster and more advanced stealth ships. As months passed, it became clear that the encounter with the Collective had marked the beginning of a new era in galactic politics, because humanity had demonstrated that young species could resist conquest by preparing for conflict before it arrived, and by refusing to limit themselves to single-world development. Dr. Grant continued his work coordinating colonial expansion, and reported that new human settlements were being established at an accelerating pace, as improved ships and better colonial technology made it possible to reach more distant systems and establish larger populations. The Human Colonial Alliance signed its first formal treaty with the Collective, establishing trade relations and mutual recognition of territorial boundaries while making it clear that humanity would continue expanding and would defend its colonies against any future attempts at conquest or absorption. Admiral Morrison met with Zethkar 1 year after first contact, and both commanders agreed that the galaxy had become a more interesting place, now that it contained a species that refused to wait for others to find them, and had built an interstellar civilization specifically designed to survive contact with unknown alien powers. The High Arbitrator admitted that the Collective would need to completely revise its expansion policies now that other species had proof that conquest could be resisted by civilizations that prepared properly and spread themselves across multiple star systems before making contact with galactic society. As the second year of human-galactic relations began, it was clear that Earth had become the capital of an interstellar empire that would continue growing and exploring, and that the age of easy conquest was ending because humanity had shown other species that there were alternatives to submission or destruction when faced with superior alien technology.